No one is coming to save them, and that is the quiet conclusion sitting at the end of this entire conversation. And most people will not face it until it is far too late. What you are really watching unfold is not a sudden collapse, not some dramatic explosion, but a slow realization creeping in like fog rolling over a city at night, where visibility fades little by little until you cannot see 10 feet in front of you. And by the time people realize how blind they have become, the landscape has already changed. What we are talking about here is a shift in behavior, a shift in expectations, and more importantly, a shift in reality itself. And once you understand it fully, you start to see that this was not random. It was built piece by piece over decades, brick by brick, decision by decision, until now the structure is finally showing its cracks. For a long time, there has been a narrative that certain dynamics between men and women would remain constant no matter how much society evolved, that attraction, cooperation, and mutual dependency were permanent fixtures, like gravity holding everything in place. But what happens when one side starts to question that arrangement, not emotionally, but practically, not in theory, but in action? What happens when people stop participating, not because they are forced out, but because they quietly decide that the exchange no longer makes sense for them? That is where things begin to change in a way that cannot be reversed by speeches, hashtags, or debates, because behavior speaks louder than any ideology ever could. There is a pattern that has become harder and harder to ignore. And it is not something that can be explained away as a coincidence or a temporary phase. It is a pattern of withdrawal, of disengagement, of men stepping back from systems, relationships, and expectations that they once accepted as normal. Not loudly, not dramatically, but steadily and consistently, like someone turning down the volume on a machine that used to run at full power. And when that happens, when participation drops, the entire system begins to feel it because systems are built on participation, not just belief. For years, there has been a strong emphasis placed on independence, on self sufficiency, on the idea that traditional roles were outdated and unnecessary. And on the surface, that sounds empowering, it sounds progressive, it sounds like growth, but there is a difference between theoretical independence and practical interdependence. One exists in conversations and ideals, the other exists in reality, in the day to day functioning of life, in the small, invisible exchanges that keep everything running smoothly. When those exchanges start to disappear, people begin to notice not the ideology, but the absence. And what is interesting is that this realization is not happening all at once. It is not a headline moment. It is happening in fragments, in small observations, in quiet frustrations, and people noticing that something feels off, that something that used to be available is no longer there, that the effort they expected from others is not being offered anymore. It is like showing up to a place that used to be crowded and finding it half empty. And at first, you think it is just a slow day, but then it keeps happening again and again until you realize that people are not coming back. The deeper layer of this is not about blame or accusation, it is about understanding incentives. People respond to incentives more than anything else. And when the incentives change, behavior changes with them. If the perceived cost of participation outweighs the perceived benefit, people will eventually opt out, not out of anger, not out of rebellion, but out of simple logic. And once enough people make that decision, the collective effect becomes impossible to ignore. What you are seeing now is the result of a long period where expectations continued to rise, while returns, at least from one perspective, began to feel less certain. That imbalance does not explode overnight. It builds pressure slowly, like air filling a balloon. And for a long time, everything looks fine from the outside until one day the tension becomes too much and something gives. Not with a bang, but with a quiet release, a shift, a withdrawal. And here is where things become uncomfortable. Because once that withdrawal begins, it is not easy to reverse. You cannot simply tell people to come back, to re engage, to resume participation, if the underlying reason that caused them to step away have not been addressed. Words alone do not rebuild trust or restore incentive. People look at outcomes, not promises. They look at patterns, not isolated moments. There is also a misunderstanding that has been floating around for a long time, the idea that attention, effort, and provision are guaranteed, that they are baseline behaviors that will always exist regardless of circumstances. But those things are not guaranteed. They are choices. And when people begin to see them as choices rather than obligations, everything changes. The dynamic shifts from expectation to negotiation, from assumption to evaluation. You can see this shift in subtle ways in how people approach relationships, in how they allocate their time, and how they prioritize their energy. There is a growing focus on self preservation, on personal stability, on minimizing risk. And that focus naturally reduces the willingness to engage in situations that are perceived as unpredictable or unbalanced. It is not about rejection, it is about calculation. And when enough individuals start making those calculations independently, the collective outcome begins to look like a trend, even though it is simply the aggregation of many personal decisions. That is why it feels so difficult to address, because there is no single point of failure, no single cause that can be fixed. It is a distributed shift happening across thousands or millions of individual choices. Another layer to this is perception. How people perceive each other matters more than any official narrative. If one group begins to perceive another as adversarial, as unpredictable, or as not aligned with their interests, cooperation naturally declines. And that perception does not have to be universally accurate to have an effect. It only needs to be widely believed. Once belief shifts, behavior follows, and perception is shaped not just by personal experience, but by observation, by stories, by repeated patterns seen in the environment. When people see similar situations play out again and again, they begin to form generalizations. And those generalizations influence future decisions. This is where pattern recognition comes into play, not in a dramatic sense, but in a quiet, cumulative way, where each new observation adds to an existing mental model. What is happening now is that many individuals are relying less on what they are told and more on what they observe. They are comparing words to actions, promises to outcomes, and making decisions based on that comparison. When there is a gap between what is said and what is experienced, trust erodes, and once trust erodes, participation follows. This is not limited to one area of life, it extends into multiple domains, from relationships to social interactions to broader societal expectations. The same underlying principle applies across all of them. People engage when they see value, when they see fairness, when they see alignment. When those elements feel absent, engagement decreases. There is also an emotional component to this, but it is not the dominant factor. The dominant factor is consistency. People can tolerate a lot if they believe the system is consistent and predictable. What they struggle with is unpredictability, inconsistency, and perceived imbalance. Those are the conditions that lead to withdrawal. And once withdrawal begins, it creates a feedback loop. As participation decreases, the experience for those who remain changes, which can lead to further dissatisfaction, which can lead to further withdrawal. It is a cycle that feeds into itself, gradually accelerating over time. At the same time, those who step away often find alternative ways to structure their lives, alternative sources of fulfillment, alternative routines that do not rely on the same systems they left behind. And once those alternatives are established, the incentive to return decreases even further because people are no longer operating from a place of lack. They have built something else, something that works for them, even if it is simpler, even if it is quieter. This is where the concept of minimalism comes into play, not just in terms of possessions, but in terms of commitments, obligations, and dependencies. There is a growing appeal in reducing complexity, in focusing on what is controllable, in eliminating variables that introduce stress or uncertainty. That approach naturally leads to a different set of priorities, a different way of engaging with the world. And when you step back and look at the broader picture, you start to see that this is not just about individuals, it is about systems adjusting to new conditions. Systems that were built on certain assumptions are now encountering a reality where those assumptions no longer hold true. And when that happens, the system either adapts or it struggles. The challenge is that adaptation requires acknowledgement, and acknowledgement requires honesty. It requires looking at what is actually happening, not what people wish was happening, not what narratives suggest should be happening, but what is observable in real behavior. That is not always comfortable because it can challenge long held beliefs and expectations. But reality does not adjust to belief. Belief has to adjust to reality. And the sooner that adjustment happens, the sooner solutions can begin to emerge. Because there are solutions, there are ways to rebuild alignment, to restore balance, to create systems that work for everyone involved. But those solutions cannot be built on denial or avoidance. They have to be built on clarity, on understanding incentives, on recognizing patterns, and on being willing to make changes that address the root causes rather than the symptoms. That is the difficult part because it requires effort from all sides. And effort is not always easy to generate, especially when there is already a sense of fatigue or frustration. But ignoring the issue does not make it go away. It simply allows the trend to continue quietly, steadily, until the effects become more pronounced, more visible, and harder to manage. And that is where things stand right now, at a point where the shift is no longer subtle, where the patterns are becoming clearer, where more people are starting to notice that something fundamental has changed. The question is not whether this change is happening. The question is what happens next, how people respond to it, whether there is an effort to understand it or an attempt to dismiss it, whether there is a willingness to adapt or a resistance to change, because those responses will determine the direction of the next phase, whether it moves toward resolution or continues toward further separation. And that is the part that most people have not fully considered yet because it requires stepping outside of immediate reactions and looking at the long term trajectory. It requires asking not just what is happening now, but where it leads, what the consequences are if the current patterns continue, what kind of environment is created if participation keeps declining, if trust continues to erode, if alignment continues to weaken. Those are not easy questions, but they are necessary ones because the answers to those questions will shape the future, not in a dramatic, cinematic way, but in the quiet, everyday reality that people live in, the small interactions, the expectations, the norms that define how people relate to each other. And if you are paying attention, if you are looking at the patterns rather than the headlines, you can already see the outline of that future beginning to take shape, not fully formed, but emerging like a sketch that is gradually being filled in line by line, decision by decision, until eventually it becomes something concrete. The only thing left to determine is whether that final picture is something people are prepared for or something that catches them off guard. As this shift continues to unfold, another layer begins to reveal itself. And it is not immediately obvious unless you step back and observe the broader rhythm of behavior over time. What becomes clear is that many people are no longer reacting to isolated experiences, they are reacting to accumulated patterns. A single moment rarely changes someone's trajectory, but repeated outcomes begin to form a kind of internal ledger, a running calculation of what participation costs versus what it returns. And once that ledger tilts too far in one direction, the decision to step back stops being emotional and starts becoming procedural, almost automatic, like closing a door that no longer leads anywhere useful. This is where the idea of expectation collapse comes into play. Expectations are powerful because they shape how people interpret reality, but they are also fragile because they depend on consistency. When expectations are repeatedly unmet, people do not just become disappointed, they begin to recalibrate. They lower their expectations, or in many cases, they remove them entirely. And when expectations disappear, so does the motivation to engage in the same way as before. That is a critical turning point because once someone stops expecting something, it becomes very difficult to convince them to invest in it again. At the same time, there is a growing awareness of trade offs. For a long time, certain trade offs were accepted without much scrutiny, almost as a default setting. People participated because it was what you were supposed to do, because it was culturally reinforced, because alternatives were not as visible or accessible. But now, with more information, more options, and more visibility into different lifestyles, those trade offs are being examined more closely. People are asking whether the traditional exchange still makes sense, whether the effort required is justified by the outcome, whether there are better ways to allocate their time and resources. And when people start asking those questions in large numbers, the answers begin to reshape behavior. Some decide to continue participating, but with different boundaries, different expectations, a more guarded approach. Others decide to step away entirely, choosing to focus on areas of life where the return feels more predictable, more controllable, more aligned with their priorities. Neither choice is inherently right or wrong, but the collective effect of those choices is significant. There it is also a psychological shift that happens when people realize they have options. When someone believes they have no alternative, they are more likely to tolerate imbalance or dissatisfaction. But when alternatives become visible and viable, tolerance decreases. People become less willing to accept conditions that they previously endured, not because they have become more demanding, but because they have become more aware of what else is possible. That awareness changes the baseline. This is why the current moment feels different from previous cycles. It is not just a reaction to specific events, it is a broader recalibration of what people consider acceptable, sustainable, and worthwhile. And that recalibration is happening in real time across different groups in different ways, but with a similar underlying theme of reevaluation. Another important factor is the role of feedback loops. When behavior changes, it sends signals to others, and those signals influence further behavior. For example, when participation decreases, it can create a perception that something is wrong, which can lead others to become more cautious, which can lead to further decreases in participation. This kind of loop can accelerate changes that might otherwise have remained gradual. At the same time, there is a tendency to interpret these changes through the lens of existing beliefs, which can sometimes obscure what is actually happening. People may attribute the shift to a single cause, a single ideology, or a single group, when in reality, it is the result of multiple factors interacting over time. Simplifying it too much can lead to misunderstandings, which can make it harder to address effectively. What is needed instead is a more nuanced understanding, one that recognizes the complexity of the situation without losing sight of the key drivers. Those drivers include incentives, expectations, perceptions, and alternatives. Each of these elements plays a role in shaping behavior, and changes in any one of them can have ripple effects across the system. Incentives determine what people are motivated to do. Expectations shape how they interpret outcomes. Perceptions influence how they view others. Alternatives provide options for action. When all four of these elements shift at the same time, the resulting change can be substantial. One of the more subtle but important changes is the shift in how people view time. Time is a finite resource, and as people become more conscious of that, they become more selective about how they spend it. Activities that do not provide a clear return, whether that return is emotional, practical, or experiential, are more likely to be deprioritized. This is not necessarily a rejection of those activities, but a reordering of priorities. This reordering can have a cascading effect. As people allocate their time differently, their routines change, their social circles change, their habits change. Over time, these changes can lead to a completely different lifestyle, one that may not align with previous norms or expectations. And once that new lifestyle is established, it becomes the new baseline, making it less likely that people will revert to their previous patterns. There is also an element of adaptation at play. Humans are highly adaptable, and when circumstances change, they adjust. What might have seemed difficult or undesirable at first can become normal over time. This is particularly relevant in situations where people step away from established systems and create new ones for themselves. Initially, there may be uncertainty or discomfort, but as they adapt, those feelings diminish and the new system becomes familiar. This adaptability can reinforce the shift because it reduces the perceived cost of staying disengaged. If people can function effectively without relying on the Hey guys, in a world pushing you to own nothing and be happy, crypto is your key to survival. Join Angry's Crypto Academy to master buying, selling, and trading crypto. Make huge profits and safeguard your wealth. Plus, discover the one crypto virtually no one is talking about, poised to create new millionaires in the upcoming bull run. The link is in the description of the video below. Go check it out now. The systems they left behind, the incentive to return decreases further. This does not mean that everyone will choose the same path, but it does mean that the range of viable options has expanded. And another dimension to consider is communication. How people talk about these changes matters because it shapes how others interpret them. If the conversation is framed in a way that emphasizes conflict or blame, it can deepen divisions and make cooperation more difficult. If it is framed in a way that focuses on understanding and problem solving, it can create space for constructive dialogue. However, effective communication requires a willingness to listen as well as speak. And that can be challenging when there are strong emotions or deeply held beliefs involved. It requires setting aside assumptions and being open to perspectives that may not align with one's own. That is not easy, but it is necessary if there is to be any meaningful progress. There is also a tendency to look for quick fixes, solutions that can be implemented rapidly to reverse the trend. But complex systems rarely respond well to quick fixes, especially when the underlying issues are structural rather than superficial. Addressing those issues requires time, effort, and a willingness to engage with the root causes rather than just the symptoms. This brings us to the Yale question of sustainability. Any system that relies on continuous input from its participants must ensure that those participants see value in their involvement. If the perceived value declines, participation will eventually follow. This is true in relationships, in organizations, and in society as a whole. Sustainability is not just about maintaining the system, it is about maintaining the conditions that make participation worthwhile. When those conditions are not met, the system becomes fragile, even if it appears stable on the surface. And when enough stress is applied, whether through changing incentives, shifting perceptions, or merging alternatives, that fragility becomes apparent. What we are seeing now is a system under stress, not necessarily collapsing, but adjusting, recalibrating, and in some cases, fragmenting into smaller, more self contained units. These units operate according to their own rules, their own priorities, their own definitions of value. That fragmentation can reduce the level of cohesion, but it can also increase resilience at the individual level because people are less dependent on a single overarching system. At the same time, fragmentation can create new challenges, particularly in terms of coordination and cooperation. When different groups operate under different assumptions and priorities, aligning their actions becomes more difficult. This can lead to inefficiencies, misunderstandings, and conflicts that would not have occurred in a more unified system. Navigating this landscape requires a balance between independence and interdependence, between self reliance and collaboration. Finding that balance is not straightforward because it depends on context, on individual preferences, and on the specific dynamics of each situation. But it is an important consideration because leaning too far in either direction can create its own set of problems. There is also the issue of long term consequences. Short term decisions can have long term effects, and those effects are not always immediately visible. When people make decisions based on current incentives, they may not fully account for how those decisions will shape future conditions. This is not a flaw, it is simply a limitation of human perspective, but it is something that needs to be acknowledged. For example, widespread disengagement can lead to changes in social norms, which can influence future generations in ways that are difficult to predict. It can alter expectations, redefine roles, and reshape the way people interact with each other. These changes can be positive, negative, or a combination of both, depending on how they are managed. This is why it is important to approach the situation with a sense of awareness rather than reaction. Reaction tends to focus on immediate outcomes, while awareness considers the broader context and the potential long term implications. It allows for more thoughtful decision making, for strategies that are not just reactive, but proactive. At the individual level, this means being clear about one's own priorities, understanding one's own incentives, and making decisions that align with those factors. It means recognizing that not every path will be suitable for everyone, and that different approaches may be needed for different circumstances. At the collective level, it means fostering an environment where open dialogue is possible, where different perspectives can be considered without immediate dismissal, where solutions can be explored collaboratively rather than imposed unilaterally. This is not easy, but it is essential if there is to be any meaningful progress. As the situation continues to evolve, there will likely be periods of tension, moments where the differences in perspective become more pronounced, where the lack of alignment becomes more visible. These moments can be challenging, but they can also be opportunities for growth, for reassessment, for finding new ways to move forward. Ultimately, the direction this takes will depend on the choices that people make, both individually and collectively. It will depend on whether there is a willingness to adapt, to understand, to engage in a way that acknowledges the realities of the situation rather than avoiding them. And while it is impossible to predict exactly how things will unfold, one thing is clear: the patterns that have emerged are not random, and they are not likely to disappear on their own. They are the result of underlying forces that will continue to shape behavior until they are addressed. Understanding those forces is the first step. What comes after that is where the real challenge begins. As this continues to evolve, something even more subtle begins to take shape, and it is the quiet redefinition of value itself. Not value in the abstract sense that people talk about in theory, but value in the lived sense, the day to day calculation of what matters, what is worth pursuing, and what is worth avoiding. For a long time, value was often externally defined, shaped by cultural expectations, social norms, and widely accepted milestones. People followed a general script, not necessarily because it perfectly aligned with their personal priorities, but because it was the path that had been reinforced over time. Now, that script is being questioned in a way that feels less like rebellion and more like recalibration. When individuals begin to define value for themselves rather than inheriting it, the results can look unpredictable from the outside. Choices that once seemed obvious become optional. Paths that once seemed inevitable become negotiable. And when enough people start making those independent evaluations, the collective picture becomes harder to predict because it is no longer guided by a single dominant narrative. It becomes a mosaic of individual decisions, each shaped by its own logic, its own priorities, its own assessment of risk and reward. This shift towards self defined value also changes how people interpret effort. Effort is no longer seen as inherently virtuous if it does not produce a meaningful return. There is a growing emphasis on efficiency, on intentionality, on directing effort toward outcomes that feel tangible and worthwhile. This does not mean that people are unwilling to work hard, but it does mean that they are more selective about where that effort is invested. The idea of investing heavily in something that feels uncertain or imbalanced is becoming less appealing. At the same time, there is a growing awareness of opportunity cost. Every decision to engage in one area means a decision not to engage in another. This awareness sharpens priorities because it forces people to consider not just what they are gaining, but what they are giving up. When the opportunity cost of participation becomes too high, especially in comparison to alternative uses of time and energy, disengagement becomes a rational choice rather than an emotional one. Another important development is the increasing role of observation over instruction. People are paying closer attention to what they see happening around them, to patterns that emerge in real interactions, rather than relying solely on what they are told should be happening. This observational approach can lead to conclusions that differ from established narratives because it is grounded in direct or indirect experience rather than prescribed expectations. This creates a kind of divergence between narrative and reality, where the official story and the lived experience do not always align. When that divergence becomes noticeable, trust in the narrative weakens, and people begin to rely more heavily on their own interpretations. This does not necessarily lead to consensus, but it does lead to a decentralization of belief, where multiple perspectives coexist, sometimes in tension with each other. As this decentralization continues, it also affects how influence operates. Influence becomes less centralized, less tied to traditional authority figures or institutions, and more distributed across networks of individuals. This can make it harder to control the direction of conversation because there is no single point of control. Ideas spread through observation, through repetition, through resonance, rather than through formal channels. This environment rewards clarity and consistency. Ideas that align with observable patterns tend to gain traction, while those that do not may struggle to maintain credibility. This does not mean that all widely accepted ideas are accurate, but it does mean that alignment with experience becomes a key factor in determining influence. There is also a shift in how people approach risk. Risk is being evaluated more explicitly, more analytically. Instead of assuming that certain outcomes are likely or guaranteed, people are considering a wider range of possibilities, including less favorable ones. This broader risk assessment can lead to more cautious behavior, particularly in areas where the perceived downside is significant. Caution in this context is not necessarily a negative trait. It can be a form of self preservation, a way of managing uncertainty, but it can also lead to reduced engagement, particularly in situations where the risk is perceived as high and the reward as uncertain. This again contributes to the overall pattern of withdrawal or selective participation. At the same time, there is an increasing focus on control. People are gravitating toward areas of life where they feel they have a higher degree of control over outcomes. This can include personal development, career, hobbies, and other pursuits where effort is more directly linked to results. In contrast, areas where outcomes are heavily influenced by external factors may be seen as less attractive. This focus on control can create a sense of stability, but it can also reduce the willingness to engage in more complex or uncertain interactions. It shifts the balance toward predictability and away from variability, which can have both positive and negative effects depending on the context. Another dimension to consider is the role of feedback. Feedback, both positive and negative, plays a crucial role in shaping behavior. When feedback is consistent and aligned with effort, it reinforces engagement. When feedback is inconsistent or perceived as unfair, it can discourage participation. Over time, patterns of feedback contribute to the formation of expectations and influence future decisions. In situations where feedback loops are unclear or unpredictable, people may choose to disengage rather than continue investing in an uncertain process. This is particularly true when the stakes are perceived as high because the cost of a negative outcome is greater. There is also an element of identity at play. How people see themselves influences how they behave. And as circumstances change, so can identity. When individuals adopt new priorities or new ways of living, their sense of identity may shift to align with those changes. This can reinforce new behaviors and make it less likely that they will revert to previous patterns. Identity is not static. It evolves over time, shaped by experience, by environment, by choices. And as identity evolves, so do expectations, both of oneself and of others. This evolution can create distance between past and present behaviors, making it difficult to return to previous norms, even if external conditions change. Another important factor is the role of comparison. People often evaluate their situation relative to others, and as more diverse lifestyles become visible, the range of comparisons expands. This can influence perceptions of what is normal, what is desirable, what is achievable. It can also influence satisfaction because expectations are often shaped by what people see around them. In a more diverse landscape, there is less pressure to conform to a single model, but there is also less clarity about which model to follow. This can lead to experimentation, to trying different approaches, to seeing what works and what does not. Over time, this experimentation contributes to the emergence of new norms, new patterns of behavior that may differ significantly from those of the past. As these new norms take shape, they can either stabilize or continue to evolve, depending on how well they meet the needs of those who adopt them. Stability tends to emerge when a pattern proves effective and sustainable over time. Instability persists when patterns are still being tested, still being refined. At the same time, there is a growing recognition that not all solutions are universal. What works for one person may not work for another, and trying to apply a single solution across diverse circumstances can lead to friction. This recognition encourages a more individualized approach, where people tailor their decisions to their specific context rather than relying on one size fits all models. This individualized approach can increase satisfaction because it allows for greater alignment between choices and personal priorities. But it can also reduce cohesion because it leads to a wider range of behaviors and expectations. Balancing individualization with cohesion is one of the key challenges in any evolving system. There is also a temporal aspect to consider. Changes that seem significant in the present may appear gradual when viewed over a longer time horizon. This can make it difficult to assess the pace of change accurately. What feels like a sudden shift may actually be the culmination of a long process, while what seems stable may be slowly evolving beneath the surface. Understanding this temporal dimension requires looking at trends over time, not just snapshots of the present. It requires considering how past decisions have shaped current conditions and how current decisions may shape future outcomes. This broader perspective can provide valuable context, helping to distinguish between temporary fluctuations and more enduring changes. And another layer is the role of resilience. Resilience is the ability to adapt to change, to recover from setbacks, to continue functioning in the face of uncertainty. As systems evolve, resilience becomes increasingly important, both at the individual and collective level. Those who are more adaptable are better able to navigate changing conditions, while those who rely heavily on stability may find it more challenging. Building resilience often involves diversifying sources of support, developing skills that are transferable across context, and maintaining a degree of flexibility in expectations. It is not about avoiding change, but about being prepared to respond to it effectively. At the same time, there is a tension between resilience and efficiency. Highly efficient systems can be less resilient because they are optimized for specific conditions and may struggle to adapt when those conditions change. More resilient systems may be less efficient in the short term, but better able to handle variability. Finding the right balance between these two qualities is an ongoing challenge. As the landscape continues to shift, there will likely be a period of adjustment where different approaches are tested, where some patterns prove more sustainable than others. This process is not always smooth, and it can involve setbacks, missteps, and course corrections, but it is also a necessary part of adaptation. During this period, clarity becomes especially important. Clear communication, clear expectations, clear understanding of incentives and trade offs can help reduce uncertainty and facilitate more effective decision making. Without clarity, misunderstandings can multiply, leading to further disengagement and fragmentation. It is also important to recognize that change does not affect everyone in the same way. Different individuals and groups may experience the same shift differently, depending on their circumstances, their resources, their perspectives. This diversity of experience can lead to different interpretations of the same situation, which can complicate efforts to find common ground. Finding common ground requires identifying shared interests, areas where alignment is possible despite differences in perspective. These areas can serve as a foundation for cooperation, even in a more fragmented environment. They provide a starting point for building solutions that are mutually beneficial. Ultimately, the direction of this evolution will depend on how these various elements interact, how incentives align or misalign, how expectations are managed, how perceptions are shaped, how alternatives are developed, how resilience is built, how clarity is maintained. It is a complex interplay with no single factor determining the outcome. But complexity does not mean unpredictability. Patterns can still be observed, trends can still be identified, trajectories can still be analyzed. And by paying attention to those patterns, by understanding the underlying drivers, it becomes possible to navigate the landscape more effectively, to make decisions that are informed rather than reactive. That is where things stand now, in a space where the old assumptions are being questioned, where new patterns are emerging, where the future is not fully defined, but is gradually taking shape through the accumulation of individual choices. As the landscape continues to shift, something even deeper begins to crystallize beneath the surface, and that is the realization that behavior, once changed long enough, stops feeling like a reaction and starts becoming identity. What begins as a decision to step back, to disengage, to reassess, gradually hardens into a new default state, a new way of operating that no longer feels temporary or conditional. It becomes normal. And once something becomes normal, it no longer requires justification. It no longer needs to be explained or defended. It simply is. This is the point where reversibility becomes difficult, not because people are incapable of changing again, but because the psychological cost of returning to a previous state becomes higher than the cost of continuing forward. People build routines around their new behaviors. They structure their lives differently. They adjust their expectations, their habits, their sense of what is possible and what is not. Over time, the distance between their current state and their previous one grows, not just in behavior, but in mindset. And mindset is where the real shift happens because mindset influences how people interpret opportunities. What once looked appealing may now look unnecessary. What once felt essential may now feel optional. And when that recalibration takes hold, it changes the entire decision making framework. It is no longer about whether something is good or bad in absolute terms, but whether it aligns with the current structure of one's life. There's also a quiet recalibration of emotional investment. Emotional investment is not infinite. And as people become more selective about where they place it, they begin to protect it more carefully. They avoid situations where the outcome feels uncertain or where the return on that investment is unclear. This does not mean that people become indifferent, but it does mean that they become more deliberate. Deliberation introduces a kind of friction into interactions that were once more automatic. Where there was once spontaneity, there is now consideration. Where there was once assumption, there is now evaluation. This does not necessarily eliminate connection, but it does change its nature. It becomes more conditional, more dependent on alignment and mutual understanding. At the same time, there is a growing emphasis on internal validation over external validation. People are placing more weight on their own assessments of their lives rather than relying on external approval. This shift reduces the influence of social pressure because decisions are no longer driven primarily by how they will be perceived by others. Instead, they are driven by how they align with personal priorities. This internalization of validation can lead to greater stability because it reduces the volatility that comes from constantly seeking external affirmation. But it can also lead to greater independence, which in turn can reduce the level of interdependence within the system. When people feel less need for external validation, they may also feel less need to conform to external expectations. Another dimension of this shift is the changing perception of scarcity and abundance. For a long time, certain opportunities were perceived as scarce, which increased their perceived value and motivated people to compete for them. But as alternatives become more visible and accessible, the perception of scarcity can decrease. When people believe they have multiple viable options, the urgency to pursue any single one diminishes. This does not eliminate competition entirely, but it does change its intensity and its focus. Instead of competing for a limited set of predefined opportunities, people may focus on creating or identifying opportunities that better align with their individual goals. This can lead to more diversification, but also to less convergence around a single model. As this diversification continues, it becomes harder to generalize about behavior because there is no longer a single dominant pattern. Instead, there are multiple coexisting patterns, each with its own logic, its own incentives, its own trade offs. This plurality can make the landscape feel more complex, but it also reflects a more individualized approach to decision making. There is also an emerging awareness of long term sustainability at the individual level. People are asking not just whether something works now, but whether it will continue to work over time. They are considering the durability of their choices, the likelihood that their current approach will remain viable as conditions change. This forward looking perspective can lead to more cautious but also more strategic decisions. Strategic thinking introduces a longer time horizon into decision making. Instead of focusing solely on immediate outcomes, people consider how their actions today will affect their situation tomorrow. This can lead to a preference for stability over short term gains, for consistency over volatility, for predictability over risk. At the same time, there is a recognition that not all variables can be controlled. Even with careful planning, there will always be elements of uncertainty. This recognition can lead to a more balanced approach where people seek to manage risk rather than eliminate it entirely. They focus on what they can control and accept what they cannot. Another important aspect of this evolution is the role of boundaries. As people become more selective about their time, energy, and emotional investment, they establish clearer boundaries around what they are willing to accept and what they are not. These boundaries serve as a form of self regulation, helping to maintain balance and prevent overextension. Boundaries also influence interactions with others because they define the terms of engagement. When boundaries are clear and consistent, they can facilitate more stable interactions. When they are unclear or inconsistent, they can lead to confusion and conflict. Establishing and maintaining boundaries is therefore a critical component of navigating a changing environment. There is also a shift in how people perceive responsibility. Responsibility is increasingly being viewed through the lens of agency, with individuals taking greater ownership of their own outcomes. This does not mean that external factors are ignored, but it does mean that there is a greater emphasis on personal accountability. This emphasis on agency can be empowering because it reinforces the idea that individuals have control over their decisions and their direction. But it can also be challenging because it requires a willingness to accept the consequences of those decisions. It places a greater burden on the individual to navigate complexity and make informed choices. At the same time, there is a growing awareness of the limits of individual action. While personal agency is important, it operates within a broader context that includes social, economic, and cultural factors. Recognizing these limits can help prevent unrealistic expectations and encourage a more balanced perspective. Another layer to consider is the role of adaptation at the system level. As individual behaviors change, systems must adjust in order to remain functional. This can involve changes in policies, in norms, in structures that govern interactions. These adjustments may lag behind individual changes, creating a period of misalignment where systems and behaviors are out of sync. During this period, there may be tension as systems attempt to recalibrate. Some adjustments may be effective, while others may not fully address the underlying issues. This process of trial and error is a natural part of adaptation, but it can also contribute to uncertainty in the short term. There is also the question of feedback between individual and system level changes. As systems adjust, they influence individual behavior, which in turn influences further system adjustments. This creates a dynamic interplay where both levels are continuously evolving in response to each other. Understanding this interplay is important because it highlights the importance of alignment. When individual behaviors and system structures are aligned, interactions tend to be smoother, more predictable, more sustainable. When they are misaligned, friction increases and participation may decline. At the same time, there is a recognition that alignment is not static. It must be maintained and adjusted over time as conditions change. This requires ongoing attention, ongoing evaluation, ongoing willingness to adapt. It is not a one time solution, but a continuous process. Another aspect of this evolution is the role of information. Access to information has increased significantly, allowing individuals to make more informed decisions. But with increased access also comes increased complexity, because not all information is equally reliable or relevant. Navigating this landscape requires critical thinking, the ability to evaluate sources to distinguish between signal and noise. This increased reliance on information can lead to more analytical decision making, but it can also lead to information overload, where the sheer volume of data makes it difficult to draw clear conclusions. Managing this balance is an ongoing challenge. There is also a shift in how people approach uncertainty. Instead of viewing uncertainty solely as a negative, there is a growing recognition that it can also represent opportunity. Uncertainty creates space for new approaches, for innovation, for the emergence of patterns that were not previously possible. This perspective can encourage experimentation, even in the face of risk. At the same time, not everyone responds to uncertainty in the same way. Some may embrace it, while others may seek to minimize it. This diversity of responses contributes to the overall complexity of the system as different strategies coexist and interact. As these dynamics continue to unfold, one of the key questions becomes how stability is maintained in a changing environment. Stability does not necessarily mean returning to previous conditions, but rather finding new equilibria that are sustainable under current circumstances. These equilibria may differ from past norms, but they can still provide a sense of balance and predictability. Finding these new equilibria requires a combination of flexibility and consistency, the ability to adapt while maintaining core principles that provide continuity. It involves identifying which elements of the system are essential and which can be adjusted without compromising overall functionality. Ultimately, what is emerging is not a simple reversal or a temporary deviation, but a restructuring of how people approach engagement, value, and interaction. It is a process that is still unfolding, still being shaped by countless individual decisions, still open to influence and adaptation. And as this restructuring continues, it will define the contours of what comes next, not through a single defining moment, but through the accumulation of choices that, over time, create a new reality. As this restructuring deepens, another layer begins to emerge, and it is the quiet erosion of assumptions that once felt permanent. Assumptions are powerful because they operate in the background, shaping behavior without requiring constant attention. People act on them without questioning them, build plans around them, structure expectations on top of them. But once those assumptions begin to fail, even in small ways, they lose their invisible authority. What was once automatic becomes uncertain, and what was once taken for granted becomes something that must be evaluated. This evaluation process changes how people move through the world. Instead of relying on inherited expectations, they begin to construct their own frameworks, their own guidelines for decision making. These frameworks are often more cautious, more selective, because they are built from direct observation rather than abstract belief. They are shaped by outcomes rather than intentions, by patterns rather than promises. There is also a growing recognition that stability cannot be outsourced. For a long time, many people operated under the idea that stability would come from external structures, from systems that would provide consistency and predictability. But as those systems show signs of strain or inconsistency, the responsibility for stability shifts inward. People begin to build their own forms of security, their own buffers against uncertainty, whether that takes the form of financial discipline, simplified lifestyles, or reduced dependency on unpredictable variables. This internalization of stability has a profound effect on behavior. It reduces the willingness to engage in situations where outcomes feel beyond one's control, and it increases the emphasis on self reliance. It also changes how people define success. Success becomes less about meeting external benchmarks and more about achieving a sense of control, balance, and sustainability in one's own life. At the same time, there is a subtle but important shift in how people perceive effort versus outcome. Effort alone is no longer seen as sufficient justification for continued participation. There is a growing demand for alignment between effort and result, for a clearer connection between what is invested and what is received. When that connection is weak or inconsistent, motivation declines. This shift can be seen in how people approach commitments. Commitments are no longer entered into lightly because they represent an allocation of time, energy, and resources. People are more likely to evaluate commitments carefully before making them and more willing to exit them if they no longer align with their priorities. This creates a more fluid environment where engagement is conditional rather than assumed. Fluidity has its advantages because it allows for adaptation and flexibility, but it also introduces uncertainty because relationships and arrangements may be less stable than they once were. This uncertainty can be unsettling, particularly for those who prefer predictability. It requires a different approach to planning, one that accounts for variability rather than assuming consistency. Another layer of this evolution is the changing relationship between independence and connection. Independence is increasingly valued, but connection remains a fundamental human need. Balancing these two forces becomes more complex as individuals seek to maintain autonomy while also engaging with others in meaningful ways. This balance requires negotiation, clarity, and mutual understanding. When that balance is not achieved, tension can arise. Too much emphasis on independence can lead to isolation, while too much emphasis on connection can lead to dependency. Finding the right equilibrium is an ongoing process influenced by personal preferences, experiences, and the broader environment. There is also a shift in how people interpret signals from others. Signals that were once interpreted in a certain way may now be viewed differently because the underlying assumptions have changed. This can lead to misinterpretations where actions are perceived through a lens of caution rather than trust. Over time, these misinterpretations can affect the quality of interactions, making them more guarded and less spontaneous. Guarded interactions are not necessarily negative, but they do reflect, a change in baseline expectations. They indicate that people are prioritizing self-protection, that they are aware of potential risks and are taking steps to mitigate them. This awareness can improve decision making, but it can also reduce the openness that facilitates deeper connections. Another important aspect is the role of consistency. Consistency builds trust, and trust facilitates engagement. When consistency is lacking, trust becomes fragile and engagement becomes conditional. People begin to look for patterns of behavior rather than isolated instances because patterns provide a more reliable basis for prediction. This emphasis on patterns reinforces the importance of long term behavior over short term impressions. It shifts the focus from what is said to what is done repeatedly over time. This can lead to more stable evaluations, but it can also make it harder to change perceptions once they are established because changing a pattern requires sustained effort. At the same time, there is a growing awareness of the limits of perception. People recognize that their interpretations may not always be accurate, that their observations are filtered through their own experiences and biases. This awareness can lead to a more cautious approach to judgment, but it can also lead to uncertainty, where people are less confident in their assessments. Navigating this uncertainty requires a balance between skepticism and openness, between questioning assumptions and remaining receptive to new information. It requires a willingness to update one's understanding as new evidence emerges rather than clinging to outdated conclusions. Another dimension of the shift is the changing role of expectations in shaping outcomes. Expectations can act as self fulfilling prophecies, influencing behavior in ways that reinforce the initial assumption. When expectations are negative or cautious, they can lead to behaviors that limit engagement, which in turn reinforces the perception that engagement is not worthwhile. Breaking the cycle requires a conscious effort to challenge assumptions, to test whether they still hold true under current conditions. This is not always easy because it involves risk, the possibility that the outcome may not align with expectations. But without this testing, perceptions can become static, disconnected from reality. There is also a shift in how people view long term commitments. Long term commitments require a degree of trust and predictability that may feel more difficult to establish in a changing environment. As a result, some people may prefer shorter term arrangements that allow for more flexibility and adjustment. This preference for flexibility can lead to a more dynamic environment where arrangements are continually renegotiated and adjusted. While this can increase adaptability, it can also reduce stability because there is less permanence in relationships and structures. At the same time, there is a recognition that some level of stability is necessary for long term planning and coordination. Finding ways to create stability within a flexible framework becomes a key challenge, one that requires clear communication, shared expectations, and mechanisms for managing change. Another layer to consider is the role of feedback in shaping expectations. Feedback provides information about whether actions are producing the desired outcomes and it influences future behavior. When feedback is clear and consistent, it supports learning and adaptation. When it is unclear or inconsistent, it can lead to confusion and hesitation. In environments where feedback is delayed or ambiguous, people may struggle to determine whether their actions are effective. This can reduce confidence and discourage continued engagement. Improving the clarity and timeliness of feedback can therefore play a significant role in supporting participation. There is also an emerging focus on sustainability at the personal level, not just in terms of resources, but in terms of energy and well being. People are increasingly aware of the need to manage their energy carefully, to avoid overextension, to maintain a balance that allows for long term functioning. This focus on sustainability can lead to more deliberate pacing, where people avoid taking on more than they can handle, where they prioritize recovery and maintenance alongside effort. It reflects a shift away from short term intensity toward long term consistency. At the same time, there is a growing recognition that not all forms of engagement are equally demanding. Some interactions require more energy, more attention, more emotional investment than others. Being able to distinguish between these levels of demand allows people to allocate their resources more effectively. Another important aspect is the role of adaptability in maintaining engagement. As conditions change, the ability to adjust strategies becomes crucial. Rigid approaches that worked in the past may no longer be effective, and clinging to them can lead to frustration and inefficiency. Adaptability involves not just changing actions, but also updating mental models, the frameworks through which people interpret the world. It requires a willingness to question assumptions, to consider new possibilities, to experiment with different approaches. At the same time, there is a need for continuity, for maintaining certain core principles that provide stability and direction. Balancing adaptability with continuity is a key aspect of navigating change, ensuring that adjustments do not lead to a loss of coherence. There's also a shift in how people view collaboration. Collaboration is no longer seen as a default expectation, but as a conditional arrangement that depends on alignment of interests and values. When alignment is present, collaboration can be highly effective. When it is absent, collaboration may be limited or avoided. This conditional approach to collaboration can lead to more selective partnerships where people choose to engage only when there is a clear mutual benefit. While this can improve efficiency, it can also reduce the breadth of interactions, leading to more segmented networks. At the same time, there is a recognition that collaboration can create value that is not achievable individually. This creates an incentive to find ways to align interests, to identify common ground, to build frameworks that support cooperation, even in a more selective environment. Ultimately, what is unfolding is a complex process of recalibration, where individuals and systems are adjusting to new conditions, redefining expectations, reconfiguring behaviors. It is not a simple or linear process, but a dynamic one, shaped by countless interactions and decisions. And as this process continues, it will gradually solidify into new patterns, new norms, new ways of engaging with the world, patterns that reflect the cumulative effect of these shifts, patterns that will define the next phase of how people interact, how they allocate their time and energy, how they determine what is worth pursuing and what is not. As this transformation settles further into place, another dimension begins to take form, and it is the slow redefinition of what people consider normal pressure versus unnecessary burden. For a long time, certain stresses were accepted as part of the process, something that came with participation, something that was simply the cost of engaging. But as people begin to reassess their priorities, they start to distinguish between challenges that lead to growth and pressures that feel extractive, repetitive, and without meaningful return. That distinction becomes critical because once people recognize that not all pressure is productive, they begin to filter it out with increasing precision. This filtering process changes the rhythm of life. Instead of absorbing every demand placed upon them, individuals begin to screen those demands, allowing only the ones that align with their goals and rejecting those that do not. This is not an act of defiance, but an act of refinement. It is the difference between reacting to every signal and choosing which signals deserve attention. Over time, this refinement leads to a more controlled and intentional flow of energy, where effort is concentrated rather than scattered. At the same time, there is a growing awareness of asymmetry in exchanges. When one side perceives that it is consistently contributing more than it receives, the imbalance becomes difficult to ignore. This is not always measured in tangible terms, but in the overall sense of fairness, in the feeling that the exchange is sustainable over time. When that sense of fairness is absent, participation begins to feel like a drain rather than an investment. Asymmetry does not always lead to immediate withdrawal, but it creates tension. That tension accumulates over time, influencing how future interactions are approached. People become more cautious, more observant, more likely to look for signs of imbalance before committing further. This heightened sensitivity to asymmetry acts as a protective mechanism, reducing the likelihood of repeating past experiences that felt unfavorable. There's also a shift in how people interpret effort from others. Effort is no longer taken at face value, but is evaluated in terms of consistency and intent. Occasional displays of effort may no longer carry the same weight if they are not supported by a broader pattern. This places greater emphasis on reliability, on demonstrating alignment over time rather than through isolated actions. This emphasis on reliability changes the criteria for trust. Trust becomes less about initial impressions and more about sustained behavior. It is built gradually through repeated interactions that reinforce a sense of predictability. This makes trust more durable, but also harder to establish because it requires time and consistency. Another aspect of this evolution is the increasing role of personal thresholds. Each individual has a threshold for what they consider acceptable in terms of effort, imbalance, and uncertainty. As awareness increases, these thresholds become more defined, more consciously maintained. People are less likely to tolerate situations that fall outside their thresholds because they have a clearer understanding of their own limits. This clarity leads to more decisive action. Instead of remaining in situations that feel misaligned, individuals are more likely to disengage earlier before the imbalance becomes too significant. This can reduce the duration of unfavorable experiences, but it can also lead to shorter interaction cycles where engagement is tested quickly and adjusted accordingly. There is also a growing emphasis on clarity in communication. Ambiguity, once tolerated, is now more likely to be seen as a source of risk. Clear communication reduces uncertainty, aligns expectations, and facilitates smoother interactions. When communication is unclear or inconsistent, it can create confusion and lead to misaligned assumptions. This emphasis on clarity extends to intentions, expectations, and boundaries. People are more likely to seek explicit understanding rather than relying on implicit assumptions. This can improve alignment, but it can also make interactions feel more deliberate, less spontaneous. It reflects a shift toward intentionality over assumption. At the same time, there is a recognition that not all clarity can be achieved up front. Some aspects of interaction only become apparent over time through experience. This requires a balance between seeking clarity and allowing space for organic development. It involves managing uncertainty without attempting to eliminate it entirely. Another layer of this shift is the changing perception of effort allocation across different areas of life. People are increasingly aware that overinvestment in one area can lead to neglect in others. This awareness encourages a more balanced approach where effort is distributed in a way that supports overall well being rather than focusing excessively on a single domain. Balance, however, is not static. It changes based on circumstances, priorities, and phases of life. Maintaining balance requires ongoing adjustment, the ability to reassess and reallocate resources as conditions evolve. It is not a fixed state, but a dynamic process. There is also an emerging focus on the quality of interactions rather than the quantity. People are placing greater value on meaningful engagement, on interactions that provide a sense of connection, alignment, or mutual benefit. This focus naturally reduces the number of interactions, but increases their depth and significance. Quality driven engagement can lead to more satisfying experiences, but it also raises the standard for participation. When expectations for quality increase, it becomes more difficult to meet those expectations consistently, which can further reduce overall engagement. Another dimension to consider is the role of adaptation speed. Different individuals and groups adapt at different rates, which can create temporary misalignments. Those who adapt quickly may move ahead, establishing new patterns, while those who adapt more slowly may continue operating under previous assumptions. This difference in adaptation speed can lead to misunderstandings and friction. Over time, as more people adjust, the overall alignment may improve, but during the transition period, variability can be high. Managing this variability requires patience, awareness, and a willingness to navigate differences in perspective. There is also a shift in how people approach uncertainty and outcomes. Instead of assuming that uncertainty will resolve favorably, individuals are more likely to consider a range of possible outcomes, including less favorable ones. This leads to more cautious decision making, where the potential downside is weighed more heavily. This cautious approach can reduce exposure to risk, but it can also limit opportunities for engagement. It reflects a trade off between safety and exploration, between minimizing negative outcomes and pursuing positive ones. At the same time, there is a recognition that complete risk avoidance is not possible. Every decision involves some degree of uncertainty. The goal becomes managing risk in a way that aligns with one's tolerance and priorities rather than attempting to eliminate it entirely. Another aspect of this evolution is the increasing importance of alignment in values. Shared values facilitate smoother interactions because they provide a common framework for decision making and behavior. When values are misaligned, interactions may require more negotiation and adjustment, which can increase complexity. As a result, people are more likely to seek alignment in values before engaging deeply, using it as a filter to determine compatibility. This can improve the quality of interactions, but it can also narrow the range of potential connections. There is also a growing awareness of the cumulative effect of small decisions. Individual choices, when repeated over time, create patterns that shape outcomes. This awareness encourages more deliberate decision making, where even small actions are considered in terms of their long term impact. This perspective reinforces the importance of consistency because consistent actions lead to predictable patterns, which in turn lead to more stable outcomes. It shifts the focus from isolated events to ongoing behavior, from momentary decisions to sustained practices. Another layer to consider is the role of self perception in shaping behavior. How individuals view themselves influences how they act, what they expect, what they tolerate. As people adjust their self perception to align with their evolving priorities, their behavior changes accordingly. This alignment between self perception and behavior creates a sense of coherence, where actions feel consistent with identity. It reinforces new patterns, making them more stable over time. At the same time, there is a recognition that self perception is not fixed. It can be updated, refined, expanded as new experiences are integrated. This flexibility allows for continued growth, even as certain patterns become more established. There is also a shift in how people approach long term planning. Instead of rigid plans, there is a preference for flexible frameworks that can adapt to changing conditions. These frameworks provide direction without imposing strict constraints, allowing for adjustment as new information becomes available. Flexible planning can increase resilience because it allows for course correction without significant disruption. It reflects an understanding that uncertainty is inherent and that adaptability is more valuable than rigid adherence to a predefined path. Another dimension of the shift is the changing role of external validation. While it still exists, it carries less weight in decision making. People are less likely to pursue actions solely for external approval and more likely to prioritize internal alignment. This reduces the influence of social pressure, but also places greater responsibility on the individual to define their own standards. There is also an emerging emphasis on sustainability in relationships and interactions. Sustainability is not just about maintaining connection, but about ensuring that the connection remains balanced and supportive over time. This requires ongoing attention, communication, and adjustment. When sustainability is not achieved, interactions may become strained, leading to disengagement. Recognizing this early allows for adjustments to be made before the imbalance becomes too significant. Ultimately, what is unfolding is a refinement of how people engage with the world, a move toward more intentional, more selective, more balanced interaction. It is not a rejection of connection or cooperation, but a redefinition of the terms under which they occur. And as this refinement continues, it will shape the way people approach decisions, relationships, and priorities, not through sudden shifts, but through the steady accumulation of small, deliberate choices that, over time, create a new structure for how engagement is understood and practiced. As this progression continues, another layer unfolds that is less visible at first glance, but deeply influential over time, and that is the gradual recalibration of tolerance itself. Tolerance, in this context, is not about acceptance of differences, but about the threshold at which individuals decide that something is no longer worth enduring. For years, people operated with a certain baseline tolerance for inconvenience, imbalance, and uncertainty, often because they believed that enduring these things was necessary to achieve a greater outcome. But as expectations shift and alternatives become more apparent, that baseline tolerance begins to lower. When tolerance lowers, the margin for dissatisfaction narrows. Situations that might have been accepted in the past are now questioned much earlier. This does not necessarily mean that people have become less resilient, but rather that they are more selective about where they apply their resilience. They are choosing to endure challenges that lead somewhere meaningful, while rejecting those that feel cyclical or unproductive. This recalibration of tolerance changes the timing of decisions. Instead of waiting until a situation becomes untenable, individuals are more likely to act at the first signs of misalignment. This proactive approach reduces prolonged exposure to unfavorable conditions, but it also shortens the duration of engagement cycles, leading to quicker transitions between states of involvement and disengagement. At the same time, there is an increasing awareness of diminishing returns. When effort no longer produces proportional outcomes, the incentive to continue investing declines. This concept is not new, but it is being applied more consciously. People are evaluating whether additional input is likely to produce meaningful output, and when the answer appears to be no, they adjust their behavior accordingly. This evaluation process is often subtle, occurring over time rather than in a single moment. It involves observing patterns, recognizing when outcomes plateau, and deciding whether to continue or redirect effort. This gradual recognition of diminishing returns contributes to the overall trend of selective participation. Another important aspect of the shift is the growing emphasis on alignment between expectations and reality. When expectations consistently diverge from actual outcomes, it creates a disconnect that can lead to frustration. Over time, people adjust their expectations to better match what they observe, which can lead to more grounded and realistic decision making. However, this adjustment can also lead to a more cautious outlook, where expectations are tempered to avoid disappointment. While this can protect against negative outcomes, it can also limit optimism and reduce the willingness to engage in uncertain opportunities. There is also a shift in how people approach the concept of reciprocity. Reciprocity, the idea that effort and value should be exchanged in a balanced manner, is being scrutinized more closely. Individuals are paying greater attention to whether reciprocity is present and consistent, and they are less likely to continue engaging in situations where it is not. This focus on reciprocity reinforces the importance of fairness, not in an abstract sense, but in a practical, also observable way. It is about whether contributions are acknowledged, whether effort is met with effort, whether there is a sense of mutual investment. When these elements are present, engagement is more likely to continue. When they are absent, disengagement becomes more likely. At the same time, there is an increasing recognition of the role of personal agency in shaping outcomes. People are more aware of their ability to influence their own circumstances, and this awareness can lead to more intentional decision making. Instead of passively accepting conditions, individuals are more likely to actively shape their environment to better align with their preferences. This emphasis on agency can lead to greater autonomy, but it also requires a higher level of responsibility. It involves making decisions with incomplete information, accepting the consequences of those decisions, and continuously adjusting based on new insights. Another dimension of this evolution is the changing perception of time investment. Time is increasingly viewed as a non renewable resource that must be allocated carefully. This perspective encourages individuals to prioritize activities that provide meaningful returns, whether in terms of satisfaction, growth, or stability. As a result, activities that do not meet these criteria are more likely to be deprioritized or eliminated. This leads to a more streamlined approach to engagement, where only the most valuable interactions are maintained. While this can increase efficiency, it can also reduce the diversity of experiences. There's also a shift in how people interpret effort from a long term perspective. Instead of focusing solely on immediate outcomes, individuals are considering the cumulative effect of their actions over time. This long term view encourages consistency and discourages impulsive decisions that may not align with broader goals. At the same time, there is a recognition that not all long term investments yield positive outcomes. This awareness reinforces the importance of periodic reassessment, of evaluating whether a given path is still aligned with one's objectives. When misalignment is identified, adjustments are made, sometimes involving significant changes in direction. Another layer to consider is the role of emotional resilience in navigating change. Emotional resilience allows individuals to adapt to shifting conditions without becoming overwhelmed. It involves managing expectations, processing outcomes, and maintaining a sense of stability even in the face of uncertainty. As individuals develop greater emotional resilience, they become better equipped to handle variability, to engage with uncertainty without becoming disengaged. This resilience supports continued participation in areas that align with their priorities, even when conditions are not ideal. At the same time, there is a growing emphasis on protecting emotional well being. People are more aware of the impact that certain interactions can have on their mental state, and they are more likely to avoid situations that consistently produce negative effects. This protective approach contributes to the overall trend of selective engagement. Another aspect of the shift is the increasing importance of self awareness. Understanding one's own preferences, limits, and priorities allows for more informed decision making. Self awareness acts as a guide, helping individuals navigate complex situations with greater clarity. This self awareness is often developed through experience, through observing patterns in one's own behavior and outcomes. Over time, it leads to more refined decision making, where choices are aligned with a deeper understanding of what works and what does not. There is also a shift in how people approach uncertainty in relationships and interactions. Instead of assuming that uncertainty will resolve in a positive way, individuals are more likely to evaluate whether the uncertainty itself is acceptable. If the level of uncertainty exceeds their threshold, they may choose to disengage rather than wait for clarity. This approach reduces prolonged ambiguity, but it also limits the potential for outcomes that require time to develop. It reflects a trade off between immediate clarity and long term possibility. Another dimension to consider is the role of adaptability in maintaining alignment. As conditions change, the ability to adjust expectations and strategies becomes critical. Those who are more adaptable are better able to maintain engagement in evolving environments, while those who rely on static expectations may find it more difficult. Adaptability involves both cognitive flexibility, the ability to update mental models, and behavioral flexibility, the ability to adjust actions. Together, these qualities support effective navigation of change. At the same time, there is a recognition that not all changes require adaptation. Some changes may not align with one's priorities, and in such cases, disengagement may be the more appropriate response. This distinction between when to adapt and when to disengage is an important aspect of decision making. Another layer of this evolution is the changing role of expectations in shaping interactions. Expectations are becoming more individualized, reflecting personal priorities rather than collective norms. This individualization can lead to more tailored interactions, but it can also create challenges in aligning expectations between different individuals. When expectations are misaligned, it requires negotiation and communication to find common ground. Without this effort, interactions may become strained or short lived. There is also a shift in how people perceive long term stability. Stability is no longer assumed to come from external structures alone, but from a combination of internal resilience and adaptable systems. This integrated view of stability emphasizes both personal and systemic factors. As a result, individuals are more likely to invest in developing their own resilience while also seeking environments that support adaptability. This dual approach increases the likelihood of maintaining stability in a changing landscape. Another important aspect is the role of reflection in shaping future behavior. Reflection allows individuals to learn from past experiences, to identify patterns, to refine their approach. It is through reflection that many of the shifts described here are reinforced and integrated into ongoing behavior. Without reflection, changes may remain superficial, but with reflection, they become embedded, influencing future decisions in a more consistent and deliberate way. Ultimately, what is taking place is not a sudden transformation, but a gradual reconfiguration of how people evaluate, engage, and allocate their resources. It is a process driven by observation, by experience, by the accumulation of insights over time. And as this reconfiguration continues, it will further solidify into a new framework for decision making, one that emphasizes alignment, sustainability, and intentionality, shaping how individuals navigate their environment in ways that reflect both their personal priorities and the evolving conditions around them. As the shift continues to mature, another subtle but powerful development begins to surface, and that is the quiet restructuring of what people consider worth pursuing in the first place. Not just how they pursue it, not just how much effort they invest, but whether the pursuit itself even qualifies as meaningful under their updated framework. This is where the transformation becomes less about reaction and more about filtration. People are no longer simply adjusting how they engage, they are deciding whether engagement belongs in their lives at all. This filtration process is driven by a sharper awareness of long term trajectory. Instead of focusing on isolated outcomes, individuals are increasingly asking where a given path leads over extended periods of time. They are projecting forward, imagining the cumulative effect of repeated actions, repeated interactions, repeated patterns. If that projected path does not align with their desired future, they begin to withdraw before fully committing. This forward projection changes the way decisions are made in the present. It introduces a layer of strategic thinking that was not always applied before. Choices are no longer evaluated only on immediate appeal or short term benefit, but on their ability to sustain a certain quality of life over time. This naturally leads to a more conservative approach in some areas and a more focused investment in others. At the same time, there is an increasing sensitivity to patterns that signal instability. People are becoming more attuned to early indicators that something may not hold up over time. These indicators may be subtle: inconsistencies in behavior, misalignment in expectations, fluctuations in reliability. But once recognized, they carry more weight than they once did. They are treated as signals to proceed with caution or to disengage entirely. This heightened sensitivity to instability reinforces the trend toward selectivity. Engagement is no longer granted freely, but earned through consistency and alignment. This creates a higher barrier to entry, where only interactions that meet certain criteria are allowed to develop further. Another layer of this evolution is the growing emphasis on self containment. Self containment refers to the ability to maintain a stable and fulfilling state without relying heavily on external inputs. It is not about isolation, but about reducing dependency to a level where external variables do not significantly disrupt one's baseline. As individuals move toward greater self containment, their need for external validation, support, or reinforcement decreases. This changes the dynamic of interaction because engagement becomes a choice rather than a necessity. When engagement is no longer driven by need, it becomes more conditional, more dependent on clear value. This shift towards self containment also changes how absence is perceived. In the past, absence may have been associated with loss or lack, but in this new framework, absence can represent stability, control, and preservation of resources. It is no longer automatically seen as something negative, but as a valid state in itself. There is also a recalibration of what constitutes effort worth making. Effort is increasingly judged not just by its intensity, but by its direction. Effort that is aligned with personal priorities and produces consistent results is valued, while effort that feels scattered or unproductive is minimized. This directional focus leads to a more streamlined approach to action. Instead of spreading effort across multiple uncertain areas, individuals concentrate on fewer, more reliable avenues. This concentration increases efficiency, but also reduces exposure to unpredictable outcomes. At the same time, there is a growing awareness of the cost of misalignment. Misalignment does not just waste time, it consumes energy, creates friction, and can have lasting effects on well being. Recognizing this cost encourages individuals to identify misalignment early and address it promptly, either through adjustment or disengagement. This proactive approach to misalignment reduces the likelihood of prolonged dissatisfaction, but it also requires a high level of awareness and decisiveness. It involves making choices that may not always be comfortable in the short term, but that support long term stability. Another dimension of the shift is the changing relationship between expectation and reality. Instead of trying to align reality with expectations, individuals are increasingly aligning their expectations with reality. This reversal reduces the gap between what is anticipated and what is experienced, leading to fewer instances of disappointment. However, this alignment also introduces a more grounded perspective where expectations are tempered by observation. This can lead to more realistic planning, but it can also reduce optimism if not balanced with openness to possibility. There is also a growing emphasis on internal consistency. Internal consistency refers to the alignment between one's values, decisions, and actions. When these elements are aligned, it creates a sense of coherence that supports stability and clarity. When they are not, it creates tension that can lead to confusion and dissatisfaction. As individuals prioritize internal consistency, they become more selective about engaging in situations that might disrupt that alignment. This reinforces the trend toward intentionality, where actions are chosen based on their compatibility with one's internal framework. At the same time, there is a recognition that complete consistency is not always possible. External factors, changing conditions, and new information can require adjustments. The goal is not rigid consistency, but adaptive coherence, maintaining alignment while allowing for necessary change. Another layer to consider is the evolving perception of long term commitments. Long term commitments are increasingly evaluated in terms of their adaptability. Instead of committing to fixed terms, individuals are more interested in whether a commitment can evolve alongside changing conditions. This perspective encourages flexibility within commitment, allowing for adjustments without complete disengagement. It reflects an understanding that static arrangements may not be sustainable in a dynamic environment. There is also a shift in how people approach opportunity. Opportunity is no longer seen as something to be pursued indiscriminately, but as something to be filtered through a set of criteria. These criteria may include alignment with values, potential for sustainable outcomes, and compatibility with existing priorities. This filtering process reduces the number of opportunities pursued, but increases the likelihood that those pursued will lead to meaningful results. It reflects a move away from quantity toward quality in decision making. Another important aspect of this evolution is the role of feedback in refining behavior. Feedback is used not just to adjust actions, but to refine the criteria used for decision making. Over time, this leads to more accurate evaluations where individuals become better at predicting which paths are likely to align with their goals. This refinement process is iterative, involving continuous observation, adjustment, and reassessment. It is through this process that individuals develop a more nuanced understanding of their environment and their place within it. There is also a shift in how people perceive uncertainty over extended periods. Short term uncertainty may be acceptable if it leads to long term stability, but long term uncertainty is increasingly avoided. This distinction influences how individuals approach different types of engagement, favoring those that offer a clearer long term trajectory. At the same time, there is an acknowledgement that some level of uncertainty is unavoidable. The focus becomes managing uncertainty rather than eliminating it, choosing situations where uncertainty is within acceptable bounds. Another dimension of this shift is the increasing importance of predictability in sustaining engagement. Predictability does not require complete certainty, but it does require a level of consistency that allows individuals to form reliable expectations. When predictability is present, engagement feels safer and more sustainable. When predictability is absent, it creates a sense of instability that can lead to disengagement. This reinforces the importance of consistent behavior and clear communication in maintaining participation. There is also a growing emphasis on the cumulative impact of decisions. Individual choices may seem small in isolation, but over time, they create patterns that shape overall outcomes. Recognizing this cumulative effect encourages more deliberate decision making, where each choice is considered in the context of its long term contribution. This perspective supports consistency because consistent actions lead to predictable patterns, which in turn lead to more stable outcomes. It also discourages impulsive decisions that may disrupt established patterns. Another layer to consider is the role of adaptability in maintaining long term alignment. As conditions evolve, the ability to adjust without losing coherence becomes critical. This requires a balance between holding on to core principles and being open to change. Adaptability is not about abandoning structure, but about modifying it to remain effective under new conditions. It is a dynamic process that involves continuous evaluation and adjustment. There is also a shift in how individuals approach engagement thresholds. Engagement thresholds define the point at which someone decides to participate or disengage. As awareness increases, these thresholds become more clearly defined and more consistently applied. This consistency in applying thresholds leads to more predictable behavior where individuals respond to similar conditions in similar ways. It reinforces the overall pattern of selective engagement. At the same time, there is a recognition that thresholds may need to be adjusted over time as new information becomes available. This flexibility allows individuals to refine their approach without becoming rigid. Another aspect of this evolution is the role of long term alignment in sustaining motivation. Motivation is more likely to persist when actions are aligned with long term goals. When alignment is absent, motivation tends to decline, leading to disengagement. This reinforces the importance of aligning actions with a clear sense of direction, ensuring that effort contributes to a meaningful trajectory. Ultimately, what is unfolding is a comprehensive reorganization of how individuals evaluate and engage with opportunities, relationships, and commitments. It is a shift toward greater intentionality, greater selectivity, and greater alignment between effort and outcome. And as this reorganization continues, it will further define the patterns of behavior that shape the evolving landscape, not through sudden changes, but through the steady accumulation of decisions that, over time, establish a new framework for how people navigate their environment. As this evolution continues to stretch out over time, another layer begins to reveal itself, and it is the quiet redefinition of what people consider necessary versus optional. This distinction, once blurred by habit and expectation, is becoming sharper. Activities, commitments, and interactions that were once assumed to be part of a standard path are now being examined more critically. People are asking whether something is truly essential to their stability and well being, or whether it is simply something they have been conditioned to accept. This shift has a cascading effect on how priorities are structured. When fewer things are considered necessary, more space is created, space that can be filled intentionally rather than by default. This intentional filling of space leads to a more curated life, where each element is chosen rather than inherited. It is not about removing everything, but about refining what remains. At the same time, there is a growing awareness of the weight of obligation. Obligation can be both a source of structure and a source of strain. When obligations align with personal values, they can provide direction and purpose. But when they do not, they can feel restrictive, limiting the ability to adapt and respond to changing conditions. As individuals reassess their obligations, they begin to differentiate between those that are self imposed and those that are externally imposed. This distinction is important because self imposed obligations are often more flexible and aligned with personal priorities, while externally imposed obligations may require negotiation or reevaluation. This reevaluation process leads to a gradual shedding of obligations that no longer serve a clear purpose. It is not always immediate or dramatic, but it is consistent. Over time, the accumulation of these adjustments leads to a significantly different structure of commitments. Another dimension of the shift is the increasing emphasis on autonomy in decision making. Autonomy is not just about having the freedom to choose, but about having the clarity and confidence to make those choices effectively. As individuals develop a stronger sense of autonomy, they become less reliant on external validation or guidance. This increased autonomy changes the dynamic of interaction. Engagement becomes more deliberate, more based on mutual agreement rather than assumption. It also introduces a higher standard for participation, where individuals expect alignment rather than simply going along with established patterns. At the same time, there is a recognition that autonomy comes with trade offs. Greater independence can lead to reduced support from external systems, requiring individuals to take on more responsibility for their own outcomes. This trade off is not always easy to manage, but it is increasingly being accepted as part of the broader shift. There is also a subtle but important change in how people perceive effort in relation to identity. Effort is no longer just something that is applied externally, but something that reflects internal priorities. When effort aligns with identity, it feels natural and sustainable. When it does not, it feels forced and draining. This alignment between effort and identity reinforces the trend toward intentionality. People are more likely to invest in areas that reflect who they are or who they want to become, and less likely to invest in areas that feel disconnected from that sense of self. Another layer to consider is the role of expectation management in maintaining stability. Expectations, when unrealistic, can create ongoing tension. As individuals become more aware of this, they begin to adjust their expectations to better align with what is achievable under current conditions. This adjustment reduces the likelihood of disappointment, but it also requires a willingness to let go of certain idealized outcomes. It is a process of grounding expectations in reality while still maintaining a sense of direction. At the same time, there is an increasing emphasis on adaptability in expectations. Instead of fixed expectations, individuals are adopting more flexible frameworks that can adjust as new information becomes available. This flexibility allows for more responsive decision making, reducing the friction that comes from rigid assumptions. There's also a growing awareness of the role of energy management in sustaining engagement. Energy, both physical and mental, is a finite resource, and how it is allocated has a significant impact on overall functioning. People are becoming more conscious of how different activities affect their energy levels, and they are adjusting their engagement accordingly. This focus on energy management leads to more selective participation, where activities that consistently drain energy without providing sufficient return are minimized. It also encourages a more balanced approach where periods of effort are followed by periods of recovery. Another important aspect of this evolution is the increasing role of personal standards in guiding behavior. Personal standards define what individuals consider acceptable, desirable, or worthwhile. As these standards become more clearly defined, they provide a framework for decision making that is less dependent on external influences. These standards are often shaped by experience by observing what leads to positive outcomes and what does not. Over time, they become more refined, allowing for more consistent and confident decision making. There is also a shift in how people approach the concept of compromise. Compromise is still a part of interaction, but it is being evaluated more carefully. Instead of compromising by default, individuals are considering whether the compromise aligns with their priorities and whether it is sustainable over time. This more deliberate approach to compromise can lead to fewer but more meaningful agreements where both parties are clear about what they are willing to adjust and what they are not. It reduces the likelihood of resentment that can arise from imbalanced compromises. At the same time, there is a recognition that not all compromises are equal. Some may be temporary adjustments, while others may require more significant changes. Understanding the nature of a compromise helps in determining whether it is appropriate in a given situation. Another dimension of the shift is the changing perception of stability over time. Stability is no longer viewed as a fixed state, but as a dynamic balance that must be maintained through ongoing adjustment. This perspective acknowledges that conditions will change and that maintaining stability requires flexibility. This dynamic view of stability encourages continuous evaluation, where individuals regularly assess whether their current approach is still effective. It supports a more responsive and adaptive way of navigating change. There is also an increasing emphasis on the role of clarity in reducing friction. Clear expectations, clear communication, and clear boundaries all contribute to smoother interactions. When clarity is present, it reduces the likelihood of misunderstandings and misaligned assumptions. However, achieving clarity requires effort. It involves articulating thoughts, listening to others, and ensuring that there is a shared understanding. This effort can be demanding, but it pays off in the form of more stable and predictable interactions. Another layer to consider is the role of consistency in reinforcing trust. Consistency over time creates a sense of reliability, which supports continued engagement. When behavior is inconsistent, it introduces uncertainty, making it more difficult to establish trust. As a result, there is a greater emphasis on demonstrating consistency through actions rather than relying on verbal assurances. This reinforces the importance of long term behavior in shaping perceptions. There is also a shift in how people approach uncertainty in long term planning. Instead of attempting to eliminate uncertainty, individuals are focusing on building systems that can function effectively within uncertain conditions. This involves creating buffers, diversifying resources, and maintaining flexibility. This approach to uncertainty supports resilience, allowing individuals to adapt without significant disruption. It reflects a move away from rigid planning toward more adaptable frameworks. Another important aspect of this evolution is the increasing role of reflection in guiding future decisions. Reflection allows individuals to analyze past experiences, identify patterns, and adjust their approach. It is through reflection that many of the insights driving the shift are reinforced. Regular reflection creates a feedback loop where experience informs future behavior, leading to continuous improvement. It is a key component of intentional decision making. There is also a growing awareness of the importance of alignment between short term actions and long term goals. When these are aligned, it creates a sense of coherence and direction. When they are not, it can lead to confusion and inefficiency. This alignment encourages more deliberate action, where each decision is considered in the context of its contribution to long term objectives. It reinforces the trend towards strategic thinking. Another dimension to consider is the role of adaptability in maintaining engagement over time. As conditions change, the ability to adjust without losing alignment becomes critical. This requires both flexibility and a clear understanding of one's priorities. Adaptability is not about constant change, but about making adjustments when necessary to maintain effectiveness. It is a balance between stability and responsiveness. There is also a shift in how individuals approach engagement thresholds. These thresholds define the conditions under which engagement is initiated or maintained. As awareness increases, these thresholds become more clearly defined and consistently applied. This consistency leads to more predictable behavior, where decisions are guided by established criteria rather than fluctuating impulses. It supports a more stable approach to engagement. At the same time, there is a recognition that thresholds may evolve as new information becomes available. This allows for refinement over time, ensuring that decision making remains aligned with current conditions. Ultimately, what is unfolding is a gradual but comprehensive reorganization of how individuals approach necessity, obligation, autonomy, and engagement. It is a shift toward greater intentionality, greater clarity, and greater alignment between actions and priorities. And as this reorganization continues, it will further shape the patterns of behavior that define how people navigate their environment, not through abrupt changes, but through the steady accumulation of deliberate choices that create a new framework for living and interacting. As this progression continues to settle into place, another layer begins to emerge, and it is the quiet transformation of how people interpret friction itself. Friction, once seen as something to push through or tolerate as part of the process, is now being examined more carefully. People are beginning to distinguish between friction that signals growth and friction that signals misalignment. This distinction becomes critical because it determines whether effort is sustained or withdrawn. Growth related friction often comes with a sense of forward movement, even if it is difficult. It feels like resistance that leads somewhere, like pressure that shapes something into a stronger form. Misalignment-related friction, on the other hand, feels repetitive, stagnant, and without clear direction. It consumes energy without producing meaningful progress. As individuals become more skilled at recognizing this difference, they begin to redirect their effort away from the latter and toward the former. This redirection has a noticeable impact on how time and energy are distributed. Instead of enduring friction indiscriminately, individuals begin to allocate their resources more precisely, focusing on areas where effort compounds rather than dissipates. Over time, this creates a more efficient pattern of engagement where fewer resources are wasted on unproductive cycles. At the same time, there is a growing awareness of the role of alignment in reducing unnecessary friction. When actions, expectations, and values are aligned, interactions tend to flow more smoothly. When they are not, friction increases, often without clear resolution. Recognizing this, individuals are placing greater emphasis on establishing alignment early before investing significant effort. This early stage filtering reduces the likelihood of prolonged misalignment, but it also means that fewer interactions progress beyond the initial stages. Engagement becomes more selective with a higher threshold for continuation. While this can lead to more efficient outcomes, it can also create a sense of scarcity in meaningful interactions because the criteria for continuation are more stringent. Another dimension of this shift is the changing perception of effort sustainability. It is no longer enough for effort to produce results in the short term. There is an increasing emphasis on whether that effort can be maintained over time without leading to depletion. Sustainability becomes a key factor in determining whether a path is worth continuing. This perspective encourages pacing, where individuals balance periods of effort with periods of recovery. It also discourages overextension, recognizing that short bursts of intensity that cannot be maintained may lead to instability in the long run. The focus shifts from maximum output to consistent, manageable progress. There is also a shift in how people evaluate the cost of re engagement. Once someone has disengaged from a particular path, returning to it is no longer seen as neutral. It carries a cost, both in terms of energy and in terms of reintroducing previously avoided variables. As a result, re engagement is approached with caution and often only occurs if there is clear evidence that conditions have changed. This reluctance to re engage reinforces the importance of initial alignment. If engagement is difficult to reestablish once broken, there is greater incentive to ensure that the initial conditions are suitable. This further contributes to the trend toward selectivity and careful evaluation. At the same time, there is an increasing focus on the predictability of outcomes. Predictability does not require certainty, but it does require a level of consistency that allows individuals to anticipate likely results. When predictability is present, it reduces the cognitive load associated with decision making, making engagement feel more manageable. When predictability is absent, it introduces a level of uncertainty that can be mentally taxing. Over time, individuals may choose to avoid situations where predictability is low, not because they are unwilling to take risks, but because they are prioritizing stability. Another important aspect of this evolution is the role of cumulative experience in shaping thresholds. Each experience contributes to a growing data set that informs future decisions. Over time, this data set becomes more refined, allowing individuals to make quicker and more accurate assessments of new situations. This refinement leads to a form of pattern recognition that operates almost automatically. Individuals begin to identify familiar dynamics early, allowing them to anticipate outcomes and adjust their behavior accordingly. This reduces the need for trial and error, leading to more efficient decision making. There is also a shift in how people approach the concept of investment. Investment is no longer limited to financial resources, but includes time, energy, attention, and emotional capacity. Each of these resources is being evaluated more carefully, with individuals seeking to ensure that their investments produce meaningful returns. This broader view of investment encourages a more holistic approach to decision making, where multiple factors are considered rather than focusing on a single dimension. It reinforces the importance of balance, ensuring that no single resource is overextended. At the same time, there is a growing awareness of the importance of exit strategies. Engagement is no longer seen as a one way commitment, but as a dynamic process that can be adjusted or terminated if conditions change. Having a clear understanding of when and how to exit a situation becomes an important part of managing risk. This emphasis on exit strategies does not necessarily reduce commitment, but it does provide a safety mechanism that allows individuals to engage with greater confidence. Knowing that there is a defined point at which disengagement is appropriate reduces the perceived risk of participation. Another layer to consider is the changing role of feedback in reinforcing behavior. Feedback that is timely, clear, and aligned with effort supports continued engagement. Feedback that is delayed, inconsistent, or disconnected from effort can undermine motivation. As a result, individuals are more likely to seek environments where feedback loops are strong and reliable. This preference influences where they choose to invest their resources, favoring situations that provide clear signals about performance and progress. There is also a shift in how people perceive long term consistency. Consistency is no longer viewed as rigid adherence to a fixed pattern, but as the ability to maintain alignment over time, even as conditions change. This dynamic consistency allows for adaptation while preserving core principles. This perspective encourages flexibility within a stable framework where adjustments are made as needed without losing overall direction. It supports resilience by allowing for change without disruption. Another dimension of the shift is the increasing importance of clarity and expectations. Clear expectations reduce uncertainty and facilitate smoother interactions. When expectations are ambiguous, it creates room for misinterpretation, which can lead to friction and disengagement. As a result, there is a greater emphasis on establishing expectations explicitly, ensuring that all parties have a shared understanding of what is expected. This reduces the likelihood of misalignment and supports more stable engagement. At the same time, there is a recognition that expectations may need to be adjusted over time as new information becomes available. This requires ongoing communication and a willingness to revisit assumptions, ensuring that expectations remain aligned with reality. There is also a growing focus on the role of internal benchmarks in guiding behavior. Instead of relying solely on external standards, individuals are developing their own criteria for success and progress. These internal benchmarks provide a more personalized framework for evaluation, allowing for greater alignment with individual priorities. This shift reduces dependence on external validation and supports a more self directed approach to decision making. It also allows for greater flexibility, as benchmarks can be adjusted based on changing conditions and goals. Another important aspect of this evolution is the role of discipline in maintaining alignment. Discipline is not about rigid control, but about consistent application of principles that support long term objectives. It involves making decisions that align with priorities, even when short term alternatives may be more appealing. This disciplined approach reinforces stability, ensuring that actions remain aligned with long term goals. It also reduces the likelihood of impulsive decisions that may disrupt established patterns. There is also a shift in how people approach uncertainty and decision making. Instead of seeking to eliminate uncertainty, individuals are focusing on making decisions that remain viable across a range of possible outcomes. This involves identifying options that are robust, capable of functioning under different conditions. This approach to uncertainty supports resilience, allowing individuals to navigate variability without significant disruption. It reflects a move towards strategies that are adaptable rather than optimized for a single scenario. Another layer to consider is the role of coherence in maintaining engagement. Coherence refers to the alignment between different aspects of one's life, ensuring that actions, goals, and values are integrated rather than fragmented. When coherence is present, it creates a sense of stability and direction. As individuals prioritize coherence, they become more selective about engaging in activities that may disrupt that alignment. This reinforces the trend toward intentionality and reduces the likelihood of conflicting commitments. At the same time, there is a recognition that complete coherence may not always be achievable. Life involves multiple domains, each with its own demands and dynamics. The goal becomes managing these domains in a way that maintains overall alignment without requiring perfect consistency. Another dimension of this shift is the increasing importance of long term perspective in evaluating outcomes. Short term fluctuations are viewed within the context of longer term trends, reducing the impact of temporary setbacks. This perspective supports persistence in areas that align with long term goals, while still allowing for adjustment when necessary. Ultimately, what is unfolding is a deeper refinement of how individuals interpret friction, sustainability, predictability, and alignment. It is a process of filtering, of focusing on what produces meaningful progress while minimizing exposure to unproductive cycles. And as this refinement continues, it will further shape the way individuals allocate their resources, make decisions, and engage with their environment, creating patterns that reflect a more deliberate, more strategic, and more sustainable approach to navigating an increasingly complex landscape. What all of this ultimately leads to, when you strip away the layers and look at it without distraction, is a quiet but undeniable consolidation of behavior. Not chaos, not randomness, not confusion, but consolidation. People are narrowing their focus, tightening their standards, and refining their engagement down to what is essential, predictable, and aligned. The noise that once filled the space is being filtered out, not all at once, but steadily, like sand slipping through a sieve, until only the larger, more deliberate pieces remain. This consolidation creates a very different kind of environment than what existed before. It is less reactive, less driven by impulse, and more structured around intentional choices. The pace changes, the tone changes, the expectations change, and perhaps most importantly, the margin for error changes. Where there was once room for inconsistency, there is now less tolerance. Where there was once an assumption of participation, there is now a requirement for justification. And this is where the full weight of the shift begins to land. Because once behavior consolidates at this level, it does not easily expand again. Expansion requires incentive, it requires a reason to reintroduce what has been filtered out. Without that reason, the system remains lean, efficient, and selective. It does not revert to a previous state simply because that state once existed. There is also a redefinition of what stability actually means. Stability is no longer tied to maintaining a certain external structure, but to maintaining internal consistency regardless of external variation. This is a crucial distinction. It means that stability becomes portable. It is not dependent on specific conditions being met, but on the individual's ability to maintain alignment within themselves. When stability becomes internalized in this way, it reduces the influence of external fluctuations. Changes in environment, in expectations, and available opportunities have less impact because the foundation is no longer external. It is built into the individual's framework of decision making, priorities, and behavior. At the same time, this internal stability creates a form of independence that reshapes interaction. When individuals are less dependent on external inputs for their baseline functioning, their engagement becomes more conditional. They are no longer engaging out of necessity, but out of choice. And choice introduces a different dynamic, one where alignment must be present for engagement to occur. This shift toward choice based engagement raises the standard across the board. It means that interactions must provide clear value, clear alignment, and clear sustainability. Anything that falls short of these criteria is more likely to be excluded, not out of hostility, but out of practicality. Another consequence of this consolidation is the reduction of tolerance for ambiguity. Ambiguity, once accepted as part of the process, is now more likely to be seen as a liability. It introduces uncertainty, complicates decision making, and increases the risk of misalignment. As a result, there is a growing preference for clarity, for defined parameters, for situations where expectations and outcomes are more predictable. This preference for clarity extends beyond communication into structure itself. People are gravitating toward environments that provide consistent rules, consistent feedback, and consistent outcomes. These environments reduce cognitive load, allowing individuals to focus their energy on execution rather than interpretation. There is also a noticeable shift in how effort is perceived in relation to reward. The expectation is no longer that effort alone justifies continuation. There must be a visible, consistent connection between input and output. When that connection is present, effort feels justified. When it is not, effort begins to feel like waste. This recalibration of effort reward alignment reinforces the importance of efficiency. It encourages individuals to identify the most effective ways to achieve their goals, minimizing unnecessary expenditure of resources. Over time, this leads to more optimized behavior where actions are chosen based on their likelihood of producing desired outcomes. At the same time, there is an increasing awareness of the long term impact of repeated decisions. Each decision contributes to a broader pattern, and those patterns shape overall outcomes. Recognizing this, individuals are placing greater emphasis on consistency, ensuring that their actions align with their long term objectives. This focus on consistency does not eliminate variability, but it provides a framework within which variability can be managed. It allows for adjustments without losing direction, for flexibility without sacrificing alignment. And another layer of this final stage is the stabilization of personal frameworks. Throughout the earlier phases of this shift, individuals experimented, adjusted, refined their approach. Now, those frameworks are becoming more solidified. They are no longer in constant flux, but have reached a level of maturity where they can be applied consistently across different situations. These frameworks act as filters, guiding decision making automatically. They reduce the need for constant reevaluation because the criteria for engagement are already established. This creates a more streamlined process where decisions are made more quickly and with greater confidence. There is also a shift in how people perceive external pressure. External pressure, whether social, cultural, or situational, has less influence when internal frameworks are strong. Individuals are less likely to be swayed by external expectations if those expectations conflict with their established criteria. This does not mean that external input is ignored, but it is evaluated against internal standards rather than accepted by default. This creates a more balanced approach where external factors are considered but not dominant. Another important aspect of this consolidation is the role of predictability in sustaining long term engagement. Predictability provides a sense of security, allowing individuals to plan and allocate resources effectively. When predictability is present, engagement feels manageable. When it is absent, engagement feels risky. As a result, there's a strong preference for systems and interactions that demonstrate consistent patterns over time. This preference shapes behavior, guiding individuals toward environments that offer reliability and away from those that do not. There's also a redefinition of what constitutes meaningful engagement. Meaningful engagement is no longer defined by intensity or frequency, but by alignment and sustainability. It is about whether an interaction contributes to a stable and coherent life structure rather than whether it meets external expectations. This redefinition reduces the emphasis on quantity, focusing instead on quality. Fewer interactions may occur, but those that do are more deliberate, more aligned, and more likely to be sustained over time. At the same time, there is an increasing awareness of the cost of reintroducing instability. Once a stable framework is established, introducing elements that disrupt that stability carries a higher perceived cost. This makes individuals more cautious about adding new variables, especially if those variables are associated with uncertainty. This caution reinforces the existing structure, making it more resistant to change. It does not eliminate change entirely, but it ensures that any change is carefully evaluated before being integrated. Another dimension of this final phase is the normalization of independence. Independence is no longer seen as a temporary adjustment, but as a stable state. It is integrated into identity, into daily routines, into long term planning. This normalization reduces the perceived need to revert to previous patterns because the current state is no longer seen as lacking. At the same time, independence does not eliminate the possibility of connection, but it changes its terms. Connection becomes something that must complement independence rather than replace it. It must fit within the established framework rather than disrupt it. There is also a shift in how individuals perceive long term outcomes. Long term outcomes are no longer abstract or distant, but are seen as the direct result of current patterns. This creates a stronger link between present behavior and future conditions, reinforcing the importance of consistency and alignment. This perspective encourages a more disciplined approach where actions are chosen based on their contribution to long term stability rather than short term gratification. It supports a more strategic way of navigating decisions. Another layer to consider is the role of self reinforcement in maintaining these patterns. Once a framework proves effective, it reinforces itself. Positive outcomes validate the approach, increasing confidence and reducing the likelihood of deviation. This creates a feedback loop that stabilizes behavior over time. At the same time, there is an awareness that no framework is perfect. Conditions will continue to evolve and adjustments will be necessary. But these adjustments are made within the context of an established structure rather than starting from scratch. There is also a final recalibration of expectations regarding external change. Instead of expecting external conditions to adapt to individual preferences, individuals are focusing on adapting their own frameworks to navigate those conditions effectively. This shift reduces reliance on external change as a prerequisite for stability. Ultimately, what emerges at the end of this process is a landscape defined by intentionality, selectivity, and alignment. It is not a return to previous norms, nor is it a temporary deviation. It is a new equilibrium shaped by the accumulation of countless individual decisions, each reinforcing a more deliberate approach to engagement. And this is where everything converges, the noise fades, the assumptions fall away, the patterns stabilize. What remains is a system that operates not on expectation, not on obligation, but on choice. And once behavior reaches that point, once it is governed by choice rather than default, it becomes very difficult to reverse because choice, once fully realized, does not easily surrender itself again. That is the final reality. Shout out to the 1 hour gang for staying all the way through and really thinking this through instead of just reacting to it. If you are enjoying these Angry Guy videos and you want to support the channel, you can buy me a Red Bull using the link in the description. I appreciate everyone who does. It keeps everything moving. Now, I want to hear from you. What did you think about everything that was discussed? Do you agree? Do you disagree? Or do you see something different? Drop your thoughts in the comments and let it be real. Yeah, like the video if you like it. Don't forget to subscribe. And if you like the video, share the video. And just remember that all roads lead to MWA, men walking away, and cheers.
Nothing says you care like crypto. Nothing can compare. Nothing says you care like crypto. Oh, nothing can compare to crypto.